They called him Old Henry not because they cared to know his real name, but because that's what folks called someone like him out here in Riverside Hollow. To most people, he was just a shadow drifting along the edges of town life. A bent, old man in tattered overalls, with a wiry gray beard and hands like cracked leather. His shack, if it could be called that, stood half-sunken near the marshes behind the old chapel ruins where no one went and no one cared to. He lived with the barest threads of existence. No family, no visitors. Just the wind whispering through cypress trees and the soft lull of the river that rose and fell with the seasons like a breathing ghost. Children threw pebbles at his door, called him Crazy Hank when they were feeling. Bold adults passed by with eyes that slid away, their greetings stuck somewhere in their throats. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't kind, either, or so they believed. He was just there, but the truth was, Henry spoke the language of things no one else seemed to hear anymore. He knew when the woodpeckers would come tapping on the sycamore, or when the moon would draw the foxes out. He talked to the river as if it were an old friend, and perhaps it listened. He never cursed the sky when it rained too long, nor begged it when it stayed too dry. He just endured, as nature did. In a world that moved too fast, Old Henry had slowed to the rhythm of moss growing on stone. Each morning, before the sun burned the mist off the river, Henry would be up, stooping at the edge of the bank with his homemade net, patchworked so many times it looked more thread than twine. Sometimes he caught nothing but ripperweed, sometimes a catfish or two. On rare days, a string of bream he could trade for a sack of flour at the corner store. And on days like most others, he came home with nothing but damp clothes and the silent company of solitude. But even in this hardship, there was kindness. Henry once found a heron with a broken wing and tended it for days until it flew again. He'd leave scraps for the stray hounds that circled his shack at night, and talk to the turtles sunning on the rocks like they were neighbors he'd known for years. If he caught a fish with eggs, he'd let it go. "She's got more living to do," he'd mutter, almost embarrassed by his own gentleness. And though people called him names and treated him like a burden on the town's scenery, he never once raised his voice in anger, not even when a boy snatched his hat and ran laughing down the road, or when his bait was stolen from the store's front porch. He would just nod, eyes soft, mouth silent. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't broken. He was just left behind. What they didn't see was that nature hadn't forgotten him. The river still whispered his name. The wind still rustled a lullaby through the pine. The chapel ruins long since left. Tarot still seemed to watch over him like an old friend remembering better days. And on nights when the world howled with thunder and rage, Henry would sit quietly, fingers curled around a tin cup of warm water, and speak softly to the storm like it was an old story being told again. To the world, he was a nobody. But to the earth, the trees and the river, he was still someone. A keeper of quiet promises. A witness to the small, sacred things no one writes songs about anymore. And so, the days passed. Seasons changed their coats. The town forgot him, little by little, until the night the sky broke open, and the storm came down like a reckoning. That's when something extraordinary began to unfold. Something that would turn Old Henry's forgotten life into a story that not even the river could keep to itself. Most folks never bothered to look twice at Old Henry. If they did, all they saw was a ragged figure moving slow as molasses, a man too poor to matter and too strange to understand. But they didn't see the quiet grace that shaped the small, unseen moments of his life. No one noticed how Henry would pause by the edge of the creek to untangle a dragonfly caught in a spider's web, or how he'd whistle a lullaby while pouring birdseed into an old coffee can nailed to a fence post behind the chapel. They didn't see him kneel down to lift a box turtle off the dirt road, setting it gently back in the woods where it wouldn't get crushed by a passing truck. They didn't know he fed the same 3 stray dogs every morning with scraps he could barely spare, or that he gave the last of his cornmeal to a raccoon that showed up at his porch limping and hungry one winter night. Kindness, in Henry's world, was not something you wore on your sleeve or announced with pride. It was something you did because no one else would, because it was the right thing, even if no one ever thanked you for it. There was a story the river knew well of the time. Henry caught a heavy catfish with eggs, big enough to fetch a few dollars in town. He had been hungry for 3 days by then, living on boiled dock leaves and creek water. But when he saw the swell of eggs inside the fish, he just sighed and whispered, "Not your time, Mama," and let her slip back into the muddy current. His stomach growled, but his heart was quiet. That was enough. Some mornings, he'd sit beside the ruined chapel wall, mending his net with fingers thickened by age and weather. A crow often perched on the stone beside him. "You again?" "Huh," he'd say with a smile, tossing it a crumb of stale bread. The bird would call once, like it understood. Perhaps it did. Henry wasn't just kind to animals. Sometimes, on his rare trips into town, he'd leave small whittled trinkets on doorsteps: a carved sparrow, a feather, a tiny wooden fish. No one ever saw him do it. And when folks found them, they never guessed it was the old man from the edge of the woods. They thought maybe a child had made them, or some stranger passing through. But Henry never needed them to know. That wasn't the point. He had no sermons to give, no lessons to preach. His life was the sermon. A sermon in silence. A sermon that said, do good, even when no one sees. Give, even when you have little. Love, even when it's not returned. But the world rarely rewards quiet goodness. In fact, it often punishes it with loneliness, poverty, and ridicule. Henry knew this better than anyone. Yet he never hardened. His hands, calloused and cracked, remained gentle. His back, bent and worn, never turned away from a creature in need. He gave and gave, until giving became his language, his legacy. He didn't write books, didn't build anything with nails or brick. But in the soft dirt behind the chapel, the earth remembered the press of his knees when he buried a dead squirrel with reverence. The trees remembered his songs. The wind carried his whispers like a prayer no one else heard. No one thanked him. No one clapped. No one ever said, that man saved something today. But that was all right. Because the ones who mattered had seen Dot and one stormy night. When the sky cracked open and the world held its breath, that kindness, the kind no one ever saw, would return to him in a way no one could have imagined. Just as the first winds began to rise, and Henry looked out toward the trees, with that quiet knowing in his chest. Something ancient and extraordinary was stirring beneath the roots and the rain. It began with a hush, Dot, not the peaceful kind, the kind that creeps in before something breaks. The birds stopped singing. Even the river, always murmuring softly beside old Henry's shack, seemed to still its voice. The air thickened, like wet wool. And then, from the west, came the sound, a low rumble, distant and deep, like something ancient waking from a long, bitter sleep. Henry had known storms all his life. In Riverside Hollow, storms came and went, like drunken travelers, brash, gone by morning. But this felt different. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was circling, twisting. It hissed through the trees like it was looking for something. And the sky had turned the color of bruised iron. He stood outside his shack, leaning on his cane, eyes scanning the tree line where the chapel ruins sat like a ghost of memory. Clouds rolled in fast, thick and low, scraping the treetops. Leaves flew sideways. Dust swirled in frantic patterns across the dirt path. He pulled his coat tighter, though it was already soaked from the first angry spits of rain. Thunder cracked like the snap of a whip, so sharp it made him flinch. Then came the wind, louder, fiercer. It bent the trees as if they were reeds, tore at the roof of his shack with greedy hands. Rain followed, not in drops, but in sheets, slapping the tin roof, pooling at his feet, turning the earth to mud. Inside, his shack rattled with every gust. The walls, patched with old boards and prayer, creaked like a ship on a wild sea. He sat on his stool, a candle flickering near the window, casting long shadows that trembled with each blow from the storm. He could hear the river rising, fast, and then he remembered the net, his old fishing net. The only thing he had worth anything. He had cast it earlier that day in the quiet bend of the river, near the chapel hill, hoping for a decent catch to trade for some dry beans. If the storm dragged it away, he'd have nothing to eat for days, maybe weeks. Logic told him to stay inside. He was nearly 80, body bent like driftwood. But something deeper stirred in him, something that said go. A stubborn flicker of survival, perhaps. Or the quiet voice that had always guided him when no one else would. He grabbed his oilskin poncho, cracked and faded, and pushed out into the fury. The wind hit him like a slap, nearly knocking him off his feet. Rain lashed his face. The ground sucked at his boots with every step. He leaned into the storm, one hand on his cane, the other shielding his eyes, as he made his way toward the river bend. Lightning flashed white and violently illuminating the landscape in brief, surreal glimpses. Trees leaned like they were whispering secrets. The chapel loomed in the distance, barely visible through the curtain of rain. By the time he reached the bank, the river had grown monstrous. It roared like a thing alive, angry and wild. The net was still there but tangled, half pulled by the current, and caught in a mess of branches and roots. Henry stepped into the cold water, gasping as it bit at his skin. It rose to his knees, then his thighs. He clutched a low branch for balance, inching toward the net. That's when he saw something moving in the mess of rope and debris. Not fish, not trash. Something, pale, alive. Another flash of lightning. Then he saw them. 2 serpents, white as snow, coiled and writhing, trapped in the shredded mesh and thick roots. Their scales shimmered like moonlight. Their eyes amber, glowing metis, not with fear, but something else. A plea. The rain pounded harder, the wind howled louder. But Henry stood still. He had heard stories as a boiled folk tales whispered, in the dark. Serpents of the spirit world. Guardians of the forgotten. He had never believed them. Until now. The creatures thrashed weakly, their bodies slick and trembling. One blinked slowly, its eyes never leaving his. It wasn't trying to escape, it was waiting. Henry's heart pounded, not with fear, but awe. He waded closer, hands trembling, not from cold, but reverence. He reached into the tangle, gently pulling the roots away, loosening the net. The snakes didn't strike. They didn't hiss, they simply let him work, their eyes fixed on his every move. Finally, with a grunt and a final tug, the net came free. The serpents slipped out, curling briefly in his palm school, delicate, impossibly real. Then, as quietly as they'd appeared, they slid away into the dark underbrush near the chapel hill, vanishing without a sound. Henry stood there for a long moment, soaked to the bone, breath shallow. He didn't know what he had just witnessed. A dream, a warning, a sign. All he knew was this. The night had changed, and somewhere deep inside, a seed had been planted. He turned toward home, clutching the dripping net, his eyes glancing once more toward the chapel ruins now hidden in storm and shadow. He did not yet know that this moment, this single act of compassion would ripple across the days to come, returning to him with a force greater than any storm could carry. The sky would roar again, but so too would the kindness he had quietly sown. The rain softened to a steady drumbeat, and the wind, though still fierce, no longer screamed. Henry stood in the shallows of the swollen river, his net finally freed from the knotted branches, but his eyes remained fixed on the shadows beneath the cypress roots, where moments earlier, something unearthly had stared back at him. He wasn't sure if it had really happened. The wind, the flood, the blinding flashes of lightning, it been a trick of the storm. But no, he remembered the weight of them in his hands, not heavy, but certain, real. The cold silk of their scales, the way their eyes held his those, amber eyes. Eyes that didn't reflect fear, or instinct, but intention. As he made his way back to the shack, the storm slowly retreating behind him, Henry could still feel the touch of those serpents lingering on his skin. His hands tingled with the memory. He had released them into the underbrush at the foot of the old chapel hill, that place long abandoned by people, but never quite forsaken by something older, something watching. He reached his shack just before dawn. The door hung loosely from its hinge. The roof had taken on water, and everything he owned was soaked. But Henry barely noticed. He sat in silence by the window, wrapped in a threadbare quilt, staring out toward the distant silhouette of the chapel in the pale gray light. Not because he expected to see them again, but because he couldn't stop thinking about what those eyes had said without speaking. Amber like ancient resin, like flame behind glass, eyes that shimmered with something older than time. Eyes that knew. There was a weight in them, a sadness maybe, or a question. A plea for help that had passed from one creature to another without the need for words. He'd never felt anything, like it never looked into the face of a wild thing and felt seen. They hadn't been just snakes. He knew that now. There was no explaining it in any rational way. No biology, no textbook, no wilderness manual would have prepared him for the certainty he now felt deep in his chest. Those serpents were meant to cross his path, not by accident, but by design. And something about the way they vanished. Not slithering away with fear, but moving deliberately, gracefully into the brush near the chapel left Henry with the strange sensation that the story wasn't over, that maybe it hadn't even begun. The storm had taken much his roof, his sleep, the little piece he clung to in his day-to-day survival. But in return, it had left him with something immeasurable, a sense of being part of something larger than himself. For a man the world had long forgotten, that feeling was as foreign as it was precious. He didn't tell anyone, of course. Who would believe him? The folks in Riverside Hollow already thought he was more ghost than man, a wandering relic from a time no one wanted to remember. But Henry had never needed anyone to understand him. He just needed to know what he saw, and what he felt. That night, as he drifted into uneasy sleep, a vision flickered behind his eyelids, two shapes gliding through water, eyes glowing softly beneath the chapel's crumbling stones. They weren't threatening. They weren't holy. They simply were. Silent guardians of something hidden, something sacred. He woke with the sun on his face, and the whisper of wind through cracked boards. The air was clear now, fresh. The storm had passed, but something had shifted. The river's song was different, and in the corners of his mind, those amber eyes still watched, still waited. What Henry didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was that their return would come sooner than he ever expected. Not in dreams, not in visions, but in the living, breathing stillness of a coming moment, when fate would test his quiet kindness in the most unexpected of ways. A week passed, and the storm was now just a story riding the breeze in Riverside Hollow. Mud had dried into cracked veins across the earth, and branches torn loose still hung from fences like forgotten warnings. Henry's shack had survived, but the roof still leaked, and the floor sloped more than ever. He didn't complain. He never did. On a quiet afternoon, with the sun boiling low in the sky and cicadas singing their endless song, Henry sat beneath the gnarled pecan tree near the riverbank, mending his torn fishing net. The tree had been his old companion for decades. It leaned a little more each year, branches heavy with age, but it gave him shade and peace, and that was more than most things in his life ever had. His fingers worked slow but sure, pulling the twine through holes like a surgeon sewing flesh. A breeze stirred the long grass, warm and gentle. The world seemed to be breathing again, safe again. Then it happened. Not with thunder or spectacle, but a sound. Just a sound. Soft, sharp. Crack. He froze. He knew that sound. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't age. It was the sound of wood under pressure, of something giving way. Henry's head jerked upward, just as a second crack rang out louder, this time unmistakable. The old tree above him groaned like a wounded animal. One of its thickest limbs, heavy with dead weight, had begun to split from the trunk. It sagged slowly, menacingly, casting a shadow across the ground where Henry sat. There wasn't time to think, but something else moved faster than thought. A blur of white dotted past, his legs soundless but certain. It brushed the dry leaves just enough to make them whisper. The movement made him flinch, just slightly, just enough to shift his weight backward, and then it fell. The branch came down like a hammer from heaven, slamming into the earth where he had been sitting not 3 seconds earlier. The impact sent a cloud of dust into the air, scattered pecan shells like shrapnel, and left the ground trembling. Henry stumbled backward, heart thudding in his chest like a war drum. He stood there, breath ragged, staring at the jagged limb now shattered across the roots. He could have died, would have died, and he knew what he'd seen. That flash of white, that soundless shape. He spun around, eyes scanning the tall grass, the brush, the edge of the woods. There, coiled beneath a fallen log, still as carved ivory, was one of the serpents. Its body glowed softly in the filtered sunlight, eyes of amber fixed on him like lanterns in a storm. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its message had already been delivered. Henry didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his hands trembling not from fear, but awe, gratitude. The snake blinked once and then slipped away into the brush, vanishing as quickly and silently as it had come. He stood there for a long while, not moving, not blinking, the scent of crushed leaves and dust heavy in the air. His knees gave way eventually, and he sat again, this time on safer ground, staring at the branch that would have crushed him. He didn't need proof, not for this. He didn't need to tell anyone. Who would listen? Who would believe? But in the quiet of that moment, surrounded by broken wood and sun-dappled silence, Henry felt something rise within him. Not fear, not even relief, it was connection. Something unseen had seen him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was being watched, guarded. The kindness he gave to the world unnoticed, uncelebrated, was returning in ways he never imagined. The snake didn't just save his life, it affirmed it. Later that night, as the sky turned copper and the river whispered its lullaby, Henry sat on his porch, staring out toward the chapel hill. The same thoughts circled his heart like moths to flame. Why me? What do they want? But, in the end, he didn't need the answers. He only needed the truth that pulsed through his veins with each quiet beat of his heart. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And that would matter more than he could possibly know in the nights to come, when the watchers in the dark would not only return but stand between him and something far more dangerous than a falling limb. It was hard to explain, even to himself. But after that day, beneath the pecan tree, Henry felt, accompanied, not watched in a way that made his skin crawl, not followed like prey, just seen. The kind of seeing that made you straighten your back without knowing why. That made you look twice into the trees, certain you weren't alone, but not afraid of it. There was no schedule to it, no pattern. But some mornings, as he waded knee-deep in the river to set his old net, he could swear something rippled just beneath the surface beside him. A glint of white, a movement too smooth to be driftwood. Other times, a low hiss of grass behind him would make him turn, only to find nothing but wind. Yet he knew. Like a child knows, the shadow under their bed isn't just made by the moonlight. Henry knew. He began to notice the difference in his catches. Before, his days were a gamblesome fish here, mostly scraps. But now, the net came up heavier. More often than not, there was enough fish for himself, and a little extra. Enough to trade for salt, or even a pouch of coffee from the feed store if the clerk was in a generous mood. He didn't say anything, not even to the river. What was there to say? Thank you, seemed a small dud at night. He'd sit on his creaking porch and sip hot water from a tin mug. The world would dim around him, mosquitoes humming, frogs calling from the marsh, and he'd look up at the chapel on the hill, barely a silhouette in the twilight. He felt them then, somewhere in the brush, or curled beneath the broken stones. Close, but never intrusive. They were never meant for spectacle. They were protectors, made of silence. And Henry had always understood silence better than most. Once, just before dawn, he found a rabbit lying limp in the reeds by the chapel's edge. It wasn't dead, just stunned, a thin red scratch across its belly. He reached down, gently picked it up, carried it to the shade, and dressed the wound with a strip of linen from his coat sleeve. He left it curled on a bed of dry moss. By the next morning, it was gone. What struck him wasn't the rabbit's recovery. It was what he saw beside the empty patch of moss, too long, smooth trails in the dirt, as though something had circled the rabbit through the night, guarded it. That's when it began to change for Henry. He started leaving things behind. Little offerings, a smoked fish wrapped in leaves, a handful of boiled corn, a wooden carving of a sparrow he'd shaped with his penknife. Not because he wanted payment, because he wanted to say, I see you too. He didn't talk about the serpents. He didn't name them. To give them names would have made them smaller somehow, too human. They were not pets, not spirits. Exactly. There was something in between, a bridge between the earth and what it remembers. Some in town started noticing that Henry looked different, a little more upright, a little less worn. Storm must have knocked the sense back into him, someone joked, at the diner, but no one cared enough to ask why. He smiled a little more when he passed the chapel, why he sometimes paused and looked toward the trees, like listening to a voice only he could hear. Even when the rumors began, the ones wrapped in superstition and whispers, Henry kept silent. They'd say what they wanted. They always had. But he knew the truth. Something had chosen to walk beside him. Not because he was special, but because he had offered something no one else had: mercy without expectation, kindness without witnesses, and soon he would need them more than ever. Because while the guardians moved in silence, there were others who crept in the dark for different reasons. Hungrier ones, meaner ones, and their eyes held no amber glow. They came not to protect, but to take, and in the stillness of an approaching night, they were already drawing near. It was the kind of night where the stars hid behind clouds, and the air felt too still, like the world was holding its breath. Crickets sang their tired lullaby, and the river moved slow, almost sleepy. But something beneath that quiet carried a different weight, something sharp. Watching, waiting. Henry had turned in early, the aches in his knees sharper than usual. He'd stashed his modest catch for good-sized bream, a tin bucket, under the table, and placed the rest of his dry biscuits in a sealed jar beside the stove. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through the week. Outside, the woods stretched silent under the haze of the half-moon. Somewhere near the edge of the chapel hill, an owl called out once, then fell silent. It was the only warning. 3 figures emerged from the tree line, moving low and fast. Boys. Not quite men, but old enough to know better. Locals from the hollow, the kind who never worked a day unless there was liquor at the end of it. Henry had seen them before, heard them laugh at him outside the feed store. Old Man Marshrat, one of them, had once whispered loud enough for him to hear. They'd seen him trading fish, pocketing coins, and to them, that meant he had something worth taking. The shack creaked gently in the breeze as the first boot landed on the porch. They moved carefully, one by the window, one by the side wall, the last by the door, pocket knife in hand, eyes darting like raccoons. One gave the signal, a sharp snap of his fingers. That's when the first hiss sliced through the dark dot. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to stop all three in their tracks. The boy by the window leaned in, squinting toward the crack in the wall. What he saw made him stumble back so hard he knocked over the rain barrel. A long, white shape curled on the windowsill, motionless, but unmistakable. Its body shimmered like bone in the moonlight, and its eyes, those burning amber eyes, locked onto his like two lanterns lit from within. The others turned sharply at the noise, just in time to see the second serpent rise from beneath the steps, its body uncoiling in smooth, deliberate grace. No strike, no chase, just presence. One of the boys cursed under his breath. What the hell is that? I ain't sticking around to find out, another snapped, already backing toward the trees. And just like that, whatever greed or cruelty had brought them there, shriveled up like smoke in the wind. They didn't run, they bolted, tripped over roots, fell into the grass. One dropped his knife. None looked back. Henry didn't even wake. He slept through the whole thing, breathing slow and steady in the quiet that followed. The guardians didn't wake him. They didn't need to. They returned to the brush without a sound, their duty fulfilled not with violence, but with presence. It wasn't until morning that he noticed the overturned barrel and the half-buried boot print by the back door. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked toward the chapel hill. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. Once. Slow. That day, he cooked extra fish and left a piece by the chapel gate, nestled in a folded cloth on a smooth stone. A thank you, offered without a word. Word spread in town a few days later. The boys never admitted what they saw, not fully, but they spoke in hushed voices about something wrong out there, and stopped showing up near the river. They were afraid, but Henry felt safer than he ever had. Still, something lingered in his bones, of pressure, a stirring, like the wind before a storm. The guardians had made themselves known, more openly than ever, and Henry knew that kind of warning wasn't given lightly. There were shadows darker than thieves approaching, and next time, what came for him wouldn't be so easily frightened. It started with a whisper. A strange tale passed between coffee mugs and porch rails, spoken half in jest, half in fear. You hear about the boys tried to rob old Henry's place. One would say, eyebrows raised, ran off screaming about ghost snakes with eyes like fire. At first, no one believed it. Not really. It was just another tale floating through Riverside Hollow, like a leaf on the river light. Curious, and soon forgotten. But then the stories kept coming. Bits and pieces. A hunter who saw movement up near the chapel ruins swore it wasn't a deer or a coyote. A young girl who claimed she saw something white sliding between the gravestones behind the chapel. Livestock refusing to graze near the hill. Dogs howling at nothing after sundown. People started looking up at the chapel differently, no longer just an old, crumbling ruin, but something older, stranger. A place touched by something unnatural. That's when the name came. Ghost snakes. It sounded ridiculous, and yet, it stuck. Someone claimed they were the spirits of the land itself. Others said it was the devil playing tricks. The pastor in town mentioned demons from the Old Testament, with serpent forms and burning eyes. A woman at the diner swore it was witchcraft, some old swamp curse stirred up by Henry's messing with things he shouldn't. They talked about him more often now. Not to him, of course, just about him. Loud enough so he'd hear if he passed by. He's always been odd, one man said, folding his newspaper slowly. Talks to birds, feeds stray dogs like they're his kin. Wouldn't surprise me if he made a deal with something out there, another muttered. Poor folks'll do anything for gold. Henry heard it all. Not with his ears, always, but in the way people stared longer when he walked into town. In the sudden hush when he stepped into the feed store. Even children who used to throw rocks at his shack now watched him from behind fences, unsure if he was a danger or a legend. He never argued. He never explained, because what could he say? That he'd saved 2 white serpents from a river tangle, and they'd been watching over him ever since. That they showed up when he needed them most. That they felt more like family than any soul left in town. He knew how that would sound. He also knew how quickly people turned fear into cruelty when they didn't understand something. They always had. So he stayed quiet, kept to himself, went about his days with the same rhythm. Nets, fishing, tending to the chapel grounds when no one was looking. Some afternoons he would sit beneath the chapel's stone archway, eyes closed, listening to the wind brush against broken wood and moss-covered brick. It comforted him more than church sermons ever had. The rumors didn't stop. If anything, they grew wilder. Folks said Henry had buried treasure in the chapel's floor, guarded by his ghost snakes. One boy claimed he saw Henry talking to them in the moonlight. Another swore the snakes whispered secrets in a language only the dead could understand. But behind the laughter, behind the mockery, was a tremble. Because deep down, even the ones who scoffed couldn't shake the feeling that something was up. There on that hill. Something ancient. Something awake. Henry had no use for their stories. He only knew one thing. The chapel was no longer empty. It hadn't been for a long time. And in a town where mouths moved faster than minds, that made people nervous. Nervous people make dangerous choices. The air was shifting again. The weather, the river, even the birds seemed more restless. Henry could feel it in his bones. The kind of feeling a man gets before the land itself changes. The whispers were getting louder, but soon there would come a silence, the kind that settles just before the flood. It didn't begin with thunder, it began with stillness, the kind of stillness that makes the birds disappear and the insects go silent. The air in Riverside Hollow grew heavy, thick with moisture that clung to skin like breath from something too close, too old. Henry stood on his porch that morning, a half-darned net resting in his lap, and looked toward the horizon where the trees had begun to sway without wind. He knew. Not a guess, not a hunch, he knew. The river had been rising for days. Faster than usual, the spring rains had come early, then stayed too long, soaking the ground until even the roots grew tired. But this wasn't just weather. This was reckoning. By afternoon, the water crept past the usual bend, licking at the bottom step of Henry's porch. Chickens from a neighbor's yard clucked their confusion and scattered toward higher ground. In town, folks started boarding windows, moving their cars uphill. Sirens wailed faintly from across the ridge, and the sheriff's voice crackled over the radio, calling for voluntary evacuations. But no one came for Henry. No one ever did. He didn't pack. He didn't run. He simply stood on that porch, watching the earth begin to shift, and listened. The wind wasn't howling yet, but it was breathing deep, drawing in like a lung preparing to scream. The trees groaned under pressure not yet visible, and even the frogs, nature's shameless choir, had gone mute. By sundown, the water reached the door. Henry stepped inside, lifted his meager belongings to the shelves, a tin of coffee, a bundle of dry socks, the net, coiled and tied. His hands moved slowly, not from panic, but age. He'd seen storms. But this was something older, something sacred in its fury. When the first wall gave in, it wasn't the sound that woke him, it was the cold. Water rushed into the shack like a fist, swallowing the floor, snapping through rotted boards like paper. Henry barely had time to grab his coat before the current dragged the table sideways and sent his lamp crashing into the dark. He fought his way outside, water rising to his waist. The river, no longer a river, but a beast, furious and wide, consuming the hollow one plank at a time. He tried to make for the chapel. The hill was the highest ground nearby, its steps worn but steady, but the path was lost beneath churning mud and branches, and each step forward was a battle. He slipped more than once, nearly taken by the flood's grasping pull. Then, through the torrent movement, a flash of white, cutting through the dark water like a memory made flesh. Then another. The serpents. They glided ahead of him, not fighting the current, but guiding it. Their bodies shimmered with every lightning flash, curving through the flood-like lines in a story too old for words. Henry followed, not with reason, not with doubt, with faith. Each time he faltered, they slowed. Each time he hesitated, they turned back. They led him past a shattered fence, through the remains of his fishing spot, up toward the base of the chapel hill where the water had not yet claimed the stones. Henry collapsed on the lowest step, coughing river from his lungs, shivering beneath the weight of cold and exhaustion. But he was alive. The serpents circled him one slow, deliberate, then disappeared into the shadows beneath the chapel's arch. He crawled the final distance, using his hands to drag himself inside the ruined sanctuary. The roof had long since caved in, and ivy crept through every crack, but it stood, solid, defiant, the way a shelter ought to be. He leaned back against the wall, soaked to the bone, heart thudding like a drum in the dark. Outside, the flood roared on, sweeping across fields, swallowing fences, stealing everything that wasn't rooted deep. Inside, there was only breath. His, and something else. Henry was safe. Not lucky, spared by morning. The water would still churn, but the worst would pass. And within that stillness, as the sun fought to reclaim the sky, something would rise in Henry. Not just survival, but understanding. The serpents hadn't just saved his life. They'd led him home, and soon, within the heart of that crumbling chapel, he would discover why. By nightfall the rain had eased, but the cold settled in bone deep and patient. Henry lay curled on the damp stone floor of the ruined chapel, wrapped in his soaked coat, his breath thin and trembling. The heat from his body drained fast, and in its place came the fever. It crept in quietly at first, a shiver here, a flush there, but soon it was roaring through his limbs like wildfire, twisting his thoughts into spirals, pulling the past and present together into something that no longer made sense. His mind swam, and time unraveled. He saw faces long gone, yet near. His wife, Maggie, young and laughing, her apron stained with blackberry juice, as she stood on the porch of their long-lost home. She was humming that old gospel tune she used to sing when times were hard. And then, their baby girl, no older than 5, dancing barefoot in a puddle. That puddle had been part of a storm, to a softer one, decades ago. He hadn't thought of that day in years. Now it came rushing back like a flood of its own. Henry tried to move, to sit up, to speak her name. But the chapel was spinning. His skin burned, his teeth chattered. The fever held him tight. Then came the vision. It wasn't like a dream. Soft, not shapeless. It was clear. The walls of the chapel seemed to melt away, revealing a sky streaked with gold and violet. The air was still. In the center of the sanctuary, where once an altar might have stood the 2 serpents, larger now, luminous, their scales like woven starlight. They moved in perfect unison, circling one another slowly, almost ritualistically. Henry stood, though he didn't remember rising. He walked toward them, his feet light as air. No pain, no weakness. The fever had given way to something beyond flesh. The serpents turned to him, and for the first time, they spoke not with words, but with memory. He saw his own life unfold in flashes, moments no one had seen. A boy he had fed behind the schoolhouse, when the others mocked him. A dying dog he'd cradled in a ditch, whispering apologies as it slipped away. A bird nest he'd returned to its tree. One egg cracked, the other's whole. So many small acts. So many seeds sown into the earth, forgotten by all but the wind. Serpents showed him what the world had done with his kindness. How the boy became a teacher. How the dog's litter survived and brought joy to a lonely widow. How the nest hatched, and one bird migrated thousands of miles, carrying in its wings the echo of a man's quiet mercy. Henry wept on out of sadness. But all these years, he had thought his life had passed unnoticed. But the earth had remembered. The trees, the river, the creatures. And now, they had come to repay him, not in gold, but in truth. As the vision faded, the serpents began to move toward the chapel's foundation, winding slowly toward a worn slab of stone half buried beneath ivy. Henry followed dreamlike, until they stopped and turned back, eyes glowing, waiting. Then the fever broke. He awoke with a gasp, the cold chapel still around him, his coat damp, his body aching. But something was different. The fire in his chest was gone. In its place, purpose. The vision had been more than a dream, was a calling. A final message carried by guardians too old to name. He looked toward the spot where they had ended, where the slab lay waiting in silence. With shaking hands, he began to clear the vines, and what he would uncover beneath that stone would not just rewrite the ending of his story. It would echo through Riverside Hollow like a hymn carried on the wind. The morning light crept into the chapel like a hesitant visitor, brushing the stone walls with a soft golden hue. The storm had passed. Outside, the floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind twisted roots, broken fences, and the stillness of a world briefly undone. Inside, Henry sat hunched over the slab of stone at the base of the old sanctuary wall. His breath slow, his fingers raw from pulling at vines and scraping away dirt, with nothing but a pocket knife and the edge of a tin cup. The vision still burned in his mind, those glowing eyes, the circling serpents, the unspoken command to look deeper. And here he was, knees planted into the cold floor, sweat mixing with grime, as he chipped away at time itself. The slab wasn't just a piece of floor. It was older, carved differently, its edges worn smooth by generations of wind and silence. At its center was a faint marking, something like a sigil. Not quite a cross, not quite a serpent. A bridge between both, perhaps. It pulsed with a quiet reverence, as though the stone itself held breath. Henry paused, pressing his palm against it. It was warm. He didn't know how long he worked. Time didn't behave the same anymore. But when he finally loosened the edge and pried the slab upward, it shifted, with a groan heavy, reluctant, but yielding. And beneath it, darkness. Not the cold, lifeless kind, but a still, waiting dark. He reached inside with trembling hands. His fingers brushed something fabric, then wood. He drew it out slowly, carefully. It was a small chest, no bigger than a bread box, bound in iron and stained by time. No lock, no chains. Just a weight that felt like memory. When he opened it, the light caught what lay inside, and Henry's breath caught in his throat. Gold. But not the glittering kind piled in pirate tales or bank vaults. This was old gold coins etched with symbols, long erased from modern minds, chains twisted with the marks of hand-forging small idols and artifacts wrapped in faded linen. It wasn't just treasure. It was history. And not just anyone's. This place's history. It had been hidden not out of greed, but of protection. A gift meant for someone who would never take it with selfish hands. It had waited. For years, decades, maybe centuries. For someone who gave more than he ever took. For someone like Henry. Beneath the chest, folded and barely holding together, was a letter. Written in ink, faded to the color of rust. The words were sparse, but they struck like thunder. To the one who gives without asking. You are the keeper of what we could not carry. Use it, not for power, but for peace. And remember, what is earned in silence echoes louder than what is taken in pride. Henry read it twice. Then again, the weight of those words settled into his bones, deeper than the gold ever could. He sat back against the chapel wall, the open chest beside him. The morning sun now flooding through a gap in the ceiling. Like some kind of gentle verdict. He thought of the years he'd spent in the margins. The meals skipped. The kindnesses, no. One noticed the way the world had written him off, as a ghost before he ever died. And now, here he was. Chosen not by men, not by law, but by something older. Something that watched in silence and remembered mercy when the world forgot it. He didn't smile. Not at first. The moment was too sacred for that. But his hands, shaking from more than age, began to sort gently through the chest. Not counting, not measuring, just acknowledging. The same way he once tended wounded birds, buried lost animals, and whispered prayers no one else heard. This wasn't a reward, it was a message. And Henry, old and bent and forgotten by the world, was the one meant to carry it forward. Outside, the waters continued to pull back, revealing a landscape in ruin. But something new stirred beneath the wreckage, something waiting to grow. And Henry already knew what he would do next. Not hoard. Hill. Henry didn't leave Riverside Hollow. He stayed, though not in the same broken shack by the riverbank. The old chapel on the hill, once a forgotten relic, crumbling under ivy and time, slowly came alive again, under his care. With hands worn but steady, he repaired what he could, patched the holes in the roof, cleared the moss from the windows, straightened the crooked door. He didn't do it alone. The town watched, at first from a distance, then with curiosity, then with cautious wonder. He never told them about the gold. There were no flashy purchases, no brand new trucks or flashy suits, no parades. Henry didn't trade his life of simplicity for grandeur. Instead, he began to give, not all at once, but quietly, and always with care. A widow found her leaking roof mysteriously fixed one morning. The local school received new books without a name attached. The diner's broken freezer was suddenly replaced. And no one ever knew how, but they started to guess. The people of Riverside Hollow, who once muttered his name with mockery or pity, began to speak it with something else. Children who once tossed rocks at his shack now followed him up the chapel hill, helping him sweep leaves from the old stone path. The very same boys who once tried to rob him returned one day, sheepish and red-faced, and offered to repaint the chapel doors. He said nothing, just handed them brushes and pointed to the peeling frame. No sermons, no speeches, just quiet labor and slow healing. People came not to gawk, but to sit. The chapel became a place again. Not for religion, necessarily, but for remembrance, a place where people left notes in the cracks of the wall. Prayers, regrets, gratitude, and Henry read them all, sometimes late into the night, by the warm light of an oil lamp. Some, he answered. Most, he didn't have to. The serpents were never seen again, not with the eyes, but their presence lingered. In the way the wind moved differently near the altar. In the way animals gathered near the steps. In the strange peace that seemed to settle over anyone who sat beneath the chapel's arched roof. Henry never claimed to understand it all. He just knew what he had felt, what he had been shown. That love, when given without asking for anything in return, does not disappear. It moves forward, like water down a river, like roots beneath the earth, like serpents in the dark, silent and sure. He grew older, slower, his hands trembled more, his walks took longer, but his spirit remained anchored like the chapel, like the land, solid, enduring. When he passed, it was gentle. In his sleep, a soft rain tapped the chapel roof that night, and those who found him the next morning said it looked like he was dreaming, a smile still on his lips. The chest, now empty, sat quietly in the corner, its contents long turned into roofs, warmth, meals, medicine, forgiveness. They buried him beneath the chapel, near the stone that once covered the treasure. Not with marble, with wood, carved simply. He gave, and so his story spread, not through books or broadcasts, but through mouths and hearts, a legend not built on wealth, but on worth. Children now sit on the chapel steps, listening to elders tell the tale of old Henry, the man who fed the river, healed a town, and was never forgotten by the earth. And sometimes, when the fog drifts low and the cicadas fall quiet, people say they've seen two white shapes circling the edge of the chapel hill, silent, steady, watching. They are not afraid, they are loved, and love, when planted deep and tended with care, becomes the kind of legacy that not even time can wash away.